Hello, everybody. Welcome to our global Torture-Free World webinar on this year's International Day in Support of Victims of Torture. We're delighted that we can mark this important occasion together, and I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us today. My name is Andra Nicolescu, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Anti-Torture Initiative here at the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at the American University Washington College of Law. I'll be moderating today's panel. Before we get started, I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and the recording should be available on our websites, antitorture.org and torturefreeworld.org later today. If you have any technical problems, please let us know by sending a message using the question box or the chat box on your webinar screen. The Anti-Torture Initiative works with the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Professor Juan Mendez, to expand the reach and practical implementation of his recommendations in both country-specific and thematic areas. It is a core project of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at American University Washington College of Law. Founded in 1990, the center works with practitioners, academics, and students to enhance their understanding and implementation of human rights and humanitarian law domestically, regionally, and internationally. We hold more than 50 events and trainings per year, some of which are online like this one for practitioners and law students. Of note is a webinar in mid-July which will discuss the human rights implications of 2015 United States Supreme Court decisions. Please visit the website at WCL Center for HR for a list of upcoming events. In terms of what will happen today for the Torture Free World webinar, first, a special rapporteur will give some introductory remarks. Each of our guests will then tell us about their anti-torture work and share their vision for a torture-free world for approximately 5 minutes. We will hear from Ms. Annie Sofczyk, Director of the Washington office at the Center for Victims of Torture, from Mr. Gerald Stabrock, Secretary General of the World Organizations Against Torture, the OMCT, from Ms. Carla Firstman, the Director of Redress in the United Kingdom, and Reverend Laura Markle Downton, the Director of the U.S. Prison Policy and Program at the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. Lastly, there will be time for questions at the end of the presentations before we wrap up the discussion around 11 or 11:10 a.m. Please feel free to type your questions into the question box or chat box at any time during the presentation, and I hope that we can answer as many of them as possible. But note that we will not be addressing questions until the end of the presentations at around 10:30. And we unfortunately may not be able to get to all of them due to time constraints. Again, if you have any technical problems, please let us know by sending a message through the question box or the chat box on the webinars. I will now pass it along to the Special Rapporteur on Torture, Professor Juan Mendez, for some introductory remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andra, not only for your introduction, but also for the fine job in organizing and leading us through the technological maze. It all looks very good, and I'm very glad to be able to join you. I want to thank everyone who is online for being with us, but especially my fellow panelists that have already been introduced, and the organizations that have joined this coalition that we call Torture-Free World. In a 1997 General Assembly resolution that was approved 10 years after the entry into force of the Convention Against Torture, the United Nations proclaimed June 26 as the International Day in Support of Victims of Torture, with a view to the total eradication of torture and the effective functioning of the Convention. Today, anti-torture groups and individuals around the world are marking this occasion by honoring victims and survivors of torture and by taking pause to take stock of progress in the fight against torture, to discuss opportunities and challenges for the future, and to reflect on the need to continue fighting for a torture-free world. Torture seeks to deny victims inherent dignity as human beings and to destroy their personality. The prohibition against torture and other ill treatment is a jus cogens norm, a peremptory norm of international law. That is to say, a norm that is absolute and torture is therefore absolutely prohibited and cannot be justified under any circumstance. As a part of customary international law, this prohibition is binding on every member of the international community, regardless of whether a state has ratified the Convention Against Torture or other international and regional mechanisms, conventions that expressly prohibit it. The systematic or widespread practice of torture constitutes a crime against humanity. Despite progress, the struggle against torture worldwide must continue. It is especially important to regain the universal moral condemnation of torture, which has been lost in the last 10 or 15 years. The Pew Research Center this week released research that regrettably shows that across 39 countries that were surveyed, 35% of public opinion believes that the use of torture after September 11, 2001 was justified. This makes it even more imperative for ordinary citizens, activists, professionals, and indeed all stakeholders to work together to regain the moral condemnation of torture. It is within our collective power to ensure that states and their governments hold perpetrators accountable for violations of the law and put an end to this abhorrent practice once and for all. In this context, June 26 is a very important occasion to remember that the fight against torture, like many other human rights endeavors, is dependent on torture victims and survivors being empowered to speak out and participate in the eradication and prevention of torture. It is their stories that also have the capacity to shape the discourse and mobilize public opinion, and for this reason, they should be heard. It is also critical to recall that states have an obligation to investigate, prosecute, and punish each and every act of torture committed by state agents. States also have a positive obligation to exercise due diligence in securing the enjoyment of human rights against violations by private or non-state actors. We must keep in mind that a failure to hold perpetrators responsible can set very damaging precedents. As long as those responsible for torture evade accountability, would-be torturers will believe that they can too. In addition, as many of our partners working on the ground with victims and survivors of torture have reminded us this week, international law further requires that states provide victims of torture and ill treatment full and effective redress and reparation, including compensation and the means for as full rehabilitation as possible. At events held earlier this week, I reminded a group of survivors of torture and activists that there is life after torture, and expressed my belief or hope that by joining forces, we can eradicate torture in our lifetime. As a statesman and human rights defender Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it's done. I look forward to hearing from and engaging with our panelists and taking questions from the audience for the remainder of this webinar, and to continuing to work together with all of you and our partners everywhere for a torture-free world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mendes, for your statement. I will now pass it along to our first panelist, Ms. Annie Sovcik. She is the director of the Washington office of the Center for Victims of Torture.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me. Professor Mendes, I have to say that for a topic that is so harsh as torture, I often find hearing your remarks inspiring, and to strike that balance is quite a challenge. So as you know, I'm Annie Sovcik. I'm the director of the Washington, D.C. office at the Center for Victims of Torture. CVT's mission is to heal the wounds of torture and end torture worldwide. The soul of the organization is its clients and the healing and rehabilitative services it has provided to over 34,000 survivors of torture and severe war atrocities from around the world during its 30-year history. We also conduct research, provide training and capacity building services, and engage in advocacy and furtherance of our mission. We envision a world without torture. We envision a world where we can put ourselves out of business. So what does a torture-free world look like? Let's pause for a moment and reflect on what torture actually is. At its core, it's the intentional infliction of pain and suffering, physical or mental, on another individual. Torture may be used as an interrogation technique, but it's widely proven to be an ineffective and unreliable way of gathering information. The world, including Americans, must rid themselves of the misperception that torture is a useful tool or that its practice somehow keeps us safe or protected. In fact, the ways in which torture is used effectively is in crushing civil society, stifling free speech, covering up corruption, terrifying people into silence and obedience, and punishing people in the most humiliating, belittling, and dehumanizing ways possible. At the risk of oversimplifying it, basically, torture is a weapon against democratic principles such as rule of law, and it's a weapon used by repressive regimes to control their people and maintain their own power. So what does a torture-free world look like, and how do we get there? We first must recognize that the practice is often indicative or happens alongside other gross violations of human rights. So to fight torture, we must also shine light on its practice, reveal the truth, promote transparency, tackle corruption, repair lack of or failures of rule of law systems, institute safeguards and oversight, guarantee fair court proceedings, not put pressure on police to obtain confessions, whether they're true or not, provide adequate training, provide disincentives for police or interrogators or investigators or the military to torture. These are just a few thoughts on prevention. And through prevention, though prevention and accountability are intertwined, as long as torture is practiced within impunity, it will continue. I do believe that U.S. leadership in this area matters. When post 9/11, the United States went, as Dick Cheney called it, to the dark side and instituted policies of torture, twisting long-held legal interpretations in an attempt to justify it. It undermined the international prohibition against torture, as well as its own credibility and moral standing in the world. As David Gashia, an ethicist who is a member of CVT's National Advisory Council, recently noted, what happens or questioned, what happens to a country when it allows torture into its moral bloodstream? And we still haven't healed from that yet. Progress has been made, but there's still a lot of work to do to purge ourselves of that, remedy it, move forward, and ensure that it never happens again. And in fact, as Professor Mendez also quoted, a recent study by the Pew Research Center found that 6 in 10 Americans, so 50% of Americans, believe that the methods of torture, which were detailed in the U.S. Senate report on CIA torture, whose lengthy executive summary findings and conclusions were made public in late 2014, they believed that those methods were justified. And the same survey across 39 other nations revealed that 35% of people in those countries agree. So there's still a lot of work to do. There are some reasons to hope, and I think that a couple of actions in Congress in the last week or two give us a little bit of hope. I mean, first, earlier this week, Senators Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota and Representative Chris Smith from New Jersey, in a bipartisan effort, introduced the Torture Victim Relief Act of 2015, which authorizes federal funding to provide assistance to survivors of torture. And last week, in a great bipartisan vote of 78 to 21, the Senate passed an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, led by Senators John McCain and Dianne Feinstein, that would make it much, much more difficult for the U.S. government, including the CIA, to ever establish a torture program again. We hope that this will become law soon. Just in conclusion, 30 years ago, CVT was founded with a mission that strives to put ourselves out of business. Though in the meantime, we will continue to provide life-saving services to survivors until we can actually achieve that mission. The need for those services around the world are as great as ever, reinforcing the importance of this fight to finally live in a world free of torture.
Thank you so much, Annie, for that presentation, and of course for the work that the CVT does directly with victims, which is so important today and all the time. I will now pass it along to Gerald Stabrock, who is the Secretary General of the OMCT, the World Organization Against Torture. Welcome.
Thank you. Maybe just to start from where I come from, the World Organization Against Torture is a global civil society network on torture. It reflects our belief that if we want to succeed in the fight against torture, we have to support local groups, local civil society, and mobilize them against torture. So that's a little bit the background from where I will be speaking to you. Now, for me, June 26th, I think, is a central day because it forces us to remind us that torture is still a reality. It reminds us that the fight against torture starts with victims of torture or survivors of torture, and that it is really, in each and every case, it's a personal outrage to humanity. Each and every case has its own outrage and horrifying dimension. And sometimes when we speak in international law about prevention of torture, etc., it sounds very abstract. But torture is never abstract. It's always individual and concrete, while it has far broader implications on societies. And I think June 26th needs to be the day where we think about victims of torture, where we recognize that they will stay victims until there is reparation, until there is rehabilitation. It is not the act of torture has happened and then it's gone. It stays with people for their whole lives. And I think that's a dimension which often gets lost. Also, June 26th, maybe in a difficult dialogue, reminds us that it's about any victim of torture. And no matter whether it's a context of terrorism, a terror suspect, a criminal suspect, not all of the people that might be tortured might be nice, but that does not matter. The day for the days of victims of torture is anybody who has been subjected to that treatment has rights. And torture can have many faces. It can be political, it can be non-political, security, it can be for quelling social dissent, as we see very much affecting minority populations in many parts of the world, but it's always us versus the other. So I think the first thing for me is that June 26th is about victims of torture, and it reminds us about that gruesome reality that is there. The second point, I'd like to take up something that Juan Mendes said when quoting the General Assembly resolution. Total eradication. Very often when I speak to people, there is a sort of discourse that says, well, we have to do incremental changes, and that's the way forward. And sometimes maybe that is what we can achieve with certain countries. But maybe we've forgotten the overriding goal, and that is eradication, or as you say, a torture-free world. I think we have to remind us on June 26th to be ambitious. It shouldn't be something unrealistic to ask for. And sometimes I make maybe a politically incorrect comparison with slavery. We all know that there are still cases of slavery. We know that there are slavery-like practices, trafficking, and others. But by and large, it's the same type of legal prohibition, and states who engage in slavery today will be completely outcast. And we have to ask ourselves, the 70 or 80 countries that Amnesty reports in its recent report as resorting to torture, they are not outcast in the international community. Most of them are well-respected members of the international community. So maybe we need a sea change that really eradication is the target, and states that resort systematically to torture cannot be a trusted member of the international community, like we see with other such violations. Going beyond that, what needs to happen? Where are we in the fight against torture? I think on the normative basis, we have achieved a lot. We have all the international documents that we need. We have a special rapporteur, which is a very important instrument. We have the Convention Against Torture. We have the Optional Protocol. There is enough international standards. We've also invested, I think, quite considerably over the last 20 years in institutional and law building. And I'm a lawyer. I believe in institutional laws to some extent. But very often I had to see in my practice that laws can be very ineffective. You create an institution, you create a law, it gives us a perception that there's progress, where in reality there's not. So what does it mean? I think changing law sometimes is easy. Changing institutional culture is the challenge. I think preventing torture with reducing the risk of torture is important, changing institutional culture without setting a line that you get punished or disciplined if you cross a certain line, I think is a crucial element as well. And third, maybe sometimes we think a little bit too technicians. There are technical elements. We have to engage professional groups. But torture is about societal values as well, and how we mobilize society against torture. And I think June 26th reminds us that there is work to be done to work on that front. And for us as a civil society network, that's a crucial one. We have to support and mobilize civil society in countries against torture. And then change will happen. If countries know that they will, or governments know that they will be held to account, that there are groups that are monitoring them, then there is change that is possible. So maybe sometimes we've over-focused on law and institutions and not sufficiently in constituency building, mobilizing civil society. And maybe the last point related to that is, of course, there are many defenders that work against torture under grave risks, and they deserve also on a day like this our solidarity. I'm often asked, is it not too tough to work on torture? Is it not frustrating? For me, it's not, because I meet so many people who in difficult countries work against torture under grave personal risks. And I think June 26th is also about reminding that these people need our support. And my final point is picking up on something that Juan has mentioned about the universal moral condemnation. I do believe that this is what we need. I do believe that while the law has survived post 9/11, the overriding consensus that torture is wrong has suffered. And if we want to bring the world back in order, in inverted commas, I think we have to think of how we foster the universal consensus against torture. And I think we have to think about this in a time which gets politically much more divisive, with an East and West conflict that is re-emerging, with an ISIS reality in the Middle East that denies basic fundamental universal references. I think we are in a time where we cannot afford any sort of double standards anymore. I think it will be turned against the case for human rights and democracy and others immediately. And I think regaining that moral universal condemnation is absolutely central for the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Gerald, and of course also for the work that the OMCT does all over the world for capacity building, empowering, and mobilizing civil society everywhere is absolutely tremendous. We will now hear from Ms. Carla Firstman. She is the Director of Redress, and she will be speaking to us from London.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to this very important event. It's a pleasure to be part of this. And we always look to the Special Rapporteur on Torture and Professor Mendes in particular with such fondness, and he has been such a leader to us in our efforts, and we thank you so much for continuing the fight with us. I would say from our perspective, June 26th is all about survivors. It's all about people. We know about the law. We know about the different advocacy efforts around the world. But at the end of the day, today, 26th of June, is about people, individuals in different countries around the world who've suffered torture and in many respects are voiceless. This is our biggest challenge. Torture is about silencing those who've tried to express their dissent. It's about obliterating the personality of people who are already marginalized. This day, 26 June, is about remembering that these people exist, that they have views and concerns, that they need to be heard in all of our deliberations about how to overcome this horrible practice. Let me say a few words about Redress. Redress has been an organization which was founded about 22 years ago by an individual by the name of Keith Carmichael, who himself is a victim of torture, a survivor of torture, who was detained arbitrarily in Saudi Arabia in the 1980s. And to this day, 30 years later, more than 30 years later, his quest for justice continues undeterred. And this is what I find so significant about all survivors of torture that I have had the occasion to meet. The quest for justice doesn't go away, regardless of personal circumstances or life intervening factors. One's need for the acknowledgement that a harm was done remains regardless of how long of time has passed. Redress's mission is to assist victims of torture to obtain justice. We work with survivors in all parts of the world and with civil society organizations on individual cases they bring to try to obtain a measure of redress for the harm that's been suffered. We also work with civil society groups on standard setting and capacity building, particularly in countries where torture remains endemic. What do we see as being most important for a torture-free world? The main thing I would say is the principle that torture is absolutely prohibited at all times, in all places, regardless of who is accused of doing the torture and regardless of who is the intended victim. This is something which is enshrined in law, but as many have already said, we need to ensure that the public understands why it must always be the case, and there can absolutely be no exception. The second has to do with the law and the rule of law. Torture is allowed to flourish when there's no adequate response. So the independence of the judiciary and the legal system in its entirety is so important to ensure that torture has no place in our societies, regardless of where we are around the world. Transparency is also a key function. Here, transparency of detention practices, transparency of the legal system, and the importance of ensuring that there is no ability for individuals to be tortured behind closed doors. We must ensure that all detention practices are in the open so that torture can be obliterated. Additionally, witness and victim protection structures. Here, we often find that individuals are afraid to complain about the treatment that they've received because there's a risk that they can have exactions against them, the fear of reprisals. This is a fear that individual victims face, but it's also a problem for exactions against human rights defenders, lawyers, and others involved in victims' aftercare. So it's very important that the adequate structures are in place in order to ensure that complaints can be adequately carried out. Finally, I would like to underscore the importance of training of all actors in justice systems, all actors who are involved in detention, in crowd control, in protests, must receive adequate training so that the practice of torture is not seen as the outcome of law enforcement. It should be an aberration, not natural practice used by law enforcement officials. 26 June, just to come back, Redress is calling on the international community to give more attention to the plight of torture survivors around the world. We're working with partners in 4 countries in particular. We're working with La Coordinadora Nacional in Peru. We're working with Lawyers for Justice in Libya, Advocacy Forum in Nepal, and IMLU in Kenya to draw attention to the plight of torture survivors in all regions of the world and to ensure that we can have solidarity in this movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carla, for your presentation and everything that Redress does. And our last panelist is Reverend Laura Markle Downton. She is the director of the U.S. Prisons Policy and Program at the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, which is based in Washington, D.C.
Great, thank you so much. I want to start my comments on this special day to all of us internationally, all of us who are committed to human rights and to work for human dignity. A word of great thanks to the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture for his tireless leadership, for his committed advocacy, and for all of the ways that you show up in very tangible ways that are appreciated and have ripple effects far beyond what we know today. So for all of that, we thank you. I'll say a little bit about the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. As was mentioned, we are based here in Washington, D.C. We are a national membership organization made up of over 300 religious organizations from throughout the United States. We are made up of members representing the Catholic, Evangelical, Christian, Buddhist, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, and Baha'i communities, and work together to eradicate torture in U.S. policy, in U.S. practice, and in U.S. culture. So a bit about our history. We were originally founded in response to the release of the harrowing Abu Ghraib torture photos. Dr. George Hunsinger, an ethicist and theologian at Princeton Theological Seminary, called together a gathering of about 150 religious leaders from around the country, really disturbed by this question of how would he explain to his grandchildren the silence of the faith community in the face of these images. And so together our campaign was formed. And over time, we have identified 3 areas of work that are key for us as a coalition and as a campaign. And the first of which is working to end U.S.-sponsored torture. As was previously mentioned by Annie, the work in coalition with so many to support the release of the CIA torture report and ongoing legislation to ban CIA torture. Secondly, to work to confront and end the use of torture in U.S. prisons and jails throughout the U.S., understanding that widespread and systemic torture is something not just that happens perpetrated by the United States offshore, but it's something that happens right here in our communities all throughout the U.S., in our prisons and jails and detention centers. And finally, working to confront and transform the racism and bigotry that underlies and drives many of these practices and cultural acceptance of torture within our society. So how is it that we go about this work? We strategically work to organize communities of faith to advocate for legislative solutions, for administrative change, and a critical piece of that work is finding creative ways to make visible that which has been so hidden. We understand that one of the ways that torture continues in such a broad way within our context is its hiddenness. Our work to make visible and ultimately end the use of torture, and specifically speaking to the use of torture in U.S. prisons and jails, has really focused in recent years on looking at how do we stand with survivors of torture and their loved ones. One very tangible example of this is a project that's actually happening today. There are over 100 family members in the state of California, organized by the Family Unity Network, Dolores Canales, and California Families Against Solitary Confinement, who are taking a 900-mile bus trip today, marking June 26th, to visit their loved ones who are currently enduring the torture of long-term solitary confinement at the Pelican Bay State Prison in the state of California. So our partnership with them practically has looked like standing together, hosting families as they're traveling to see their loved ones. Ultimately, we know that in order to achieve and create a torture-free world together, we must work to build community and ultimately to prioritize rehabilitation, to fundamentally question a punishment paradigm that has driven the United States to be a global leader in its use of prisons and jails and its use of long-term solitary confinement. We know ultimately that in order to do this, we must confront root causes of the drivers of this oppression. So that means looking creatively at how we address racial, economic, and gender justice in order to make a torture-free world possible. So together we are finding that ultimately it's through our collective action, through raising a collective voice that looks to draw on the best of our faith traditions, our traditions that call us to be people of community, that call us to be people who understand what it means to stand together and to make family and rehabilitation a priority.
Thank you so much for that important reminder, and also for a reminder of the role that faith communities and leaders and groups can play in the struggle for a torture-free world. And thank you to all the panelists for their compelling presentations. I'm now going to open it up from to questions, which we are receiving, and I encourage you to send them I encourage the attendees to send them using the chat box or the question box on their webinar screen. So to start off, and building on what a lot of the panelists have said, and the fact that today we're focusing specifically on victims and survivors of torture, we have a lot of people from around the world viewing this webinar, and some will view it later, who are working on the ground and are activists and are also trying to create a torture-free world in their communities. So I guess the first question is, what are some common elements to strategies to assist victims of torture that you have all identified in your work? And how significantly do the needs and goals of torture victims and survivors that you have come across differ? And what are some challenges and best practices that you would highlight from your work in terms of giving advice to people working around the world on this issue also? So I don't know if somebody would like to start, or perhaps we can start with the special rapporteur.
Well, thank you. Actually, this, I think, is a question more appropriately formulated to any of the four members of the panel, because they work with advocacy organizations, and every day they strategize about how best to fulfill their mission. I very humbly understand what they do, but it's not my first priority to set up advocacy goals and mission strategies. So I would like to hear from them, and especially from any one of them that work with people working in their own communities in the eradication of torture, and what they see as both short-term and long-term goals.
Great, thank you so much. And Carla, I see you're raising your hand. Please.
Thank you. Just maybe perhaps to give an example of one of the challenges that we often encounter when working with grassroots groups and their engagement with survivors of torture and other international crimes. Often we find that there can be a very narrow process of identifying who would qualify as a victim of this type of crime. And there is a process of listening and learning to victims' communities to understand the different ways in which this crime can manifest itself. For instance, there is a commonly held misperception that it is only individuals in centers of detention who can be subjected to torture. And there is also a misperception that the main victims of torture are therefore male criminal defendants. In many communities, torture occurs outside of the detention context, in protest movements, in the context of armed conflicts. You have very different types of torture which may take place. So trying to come to terms with what is the constellation of torture survivors in a community requires quite extensive outreach and a general openness to be attuned to the different types of scenarios. So that would be one factor that I wanted to raise at the outset.
Thank you so much, and I think that raises the very important point also that evolving standards have recently, have over time resulted in more acts and practices being encompassed into the category of torture or other ill treatment, and we are increasingly looking at non-traditional or non-detention settings. So if anybody else would maybe like to address either this evolution and new practices that they've been examining in their work, and how we can keep up with the evolving definitions and standards. I think Laura, I know you mentioned some of your work on solitary confinement in the U.S. If you could shed some more light on that, I think it would be very, very interesting.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So one of our core campaign goals within our U.S. prisons program is to work to end the torture of long-term solitary confinement in U.S. prisons, jails, and detention centers, and to speak to some of the work that's been happening that's really in many ways a model for campaigns around the United States in confronting the use of solitary confinement. Leadership primarily made up of survivors of long-term isolation and their loved ones, worked to draft model legislation in the state of New York, crafting a bill called the HALT Solitary Confinement Act, Humane Alternatives to Long-Term Solitary Confinement. It's the first of its kind in that it adopts the standards suggested and set forth by the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, stating that no one should be subjected to solitary confinement beyond 15 days under any circumstances because of the very known impact on the human brain when we are denied meaningful human contact. The bill would also ban the use of isolation for the most vulnerable, including pregnant women, LGBT persons who are placed in protective custody, as well as youth. And so we really look at the work that's been done by very grassroots activists and survivors of this particular form of widespread torture within our prisons, who have then adopted this recommendation made by the Special Rapporteur to then really formulate a broad, growing statewide campaign in support of this bill. The National Religious Campaign Against Torture is one of over 50 partners in the campaign statewide, and the bill has now been in both houses of the state legislature, and has been a significant space for us to be working as members of the faith community, to be saying how do we stand together to make clear how necessary this bill is. We see in our legislative work at the state level that very often there are important efforts happening around the country prioritizing limits on solitary confinement for special populations, including youth and individuals with serious mental illness. But to have the international human rights standards to point us back to the prohibition against torture, to have the Special Rapporteur's report from 2011 calling for a prohibition beyond 15 days in all circumstances, it enables us, it enables the grassroots to have So very concrete and tangible places in which to focus our advocacy and focus our education.
Great, thank you so much. I have a question I think that Annie might be able to best address, and that's how can we encourage more countries to make the right to reparations and rehabilitations to survivors a priority? And are there any best practice examples that you could share with us from your work?
Yeah, I'll take that question. I also want to pick up on a point that Carla had made earlier on community impacts as well. You know, on reparations, it certainly is a major challenge, in part to get the perpetrators and the perpetrating governments who may still be in power to provide those remedies. I do think that there are other mechanisms, in part to try to provide greater funding and greater resources for programs, even if the perpetrating governments are not going to be the ones that are going to provide the remedy and the reparations as they should do under international law. But the UN Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture is a mechanism through which countries around the world can contribute funding to providing rehabilitative services and supporting programs that are providing legal, medical, psychological, and other victim services. And it's a way to kind of pool global resources to help meet survivors where they're at and help meet survivors' needs as they are. And unfortunately, it's a fund that has been chronically underfunded for a long time. Presently, it's at about 9 million, with the U.S. as the largest contributor at about 6.5 million, and other countries kind of not contributing in ways that they can, or I think actually should be, in order to make broader contributions to serving victims around the world. And it's one of the few kind of international multilateral mechanisms that we have for supporting programs that are serving survivors where they are.
Yeah.
Yes,
sorry.
please.
On that point, it's important to note also that for all its very limited resources, the UN Fund for Victims of Torture does wonderful work. It does provide key support to frontline activists and organizations. So it's really a pity that we don't have more support from the rest of the international community for a program that's really indispensable.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Annie, I interrupted you.
No, and I'm really glad that you did, because with the emphasis on what more is needed, it's good to not lose what actually is happening. And just to point out, that in 2015, the fund will be distributing 7.76 million in grants, and then the extra money is actually reserved for emergency grants. But the 7.76 million will support 190 projects that will reach over 57,600 survivors. And that is huge, and it's admirable. And even as we're talking about how much more is needed, thank you. It's important to not lose what actually is happening and the great work that's being done.
Great. Thank you. We have another question, which is some of you mentioned the recent Pew study with the shocking results about still pretty wide acceptance of torture. And Gerald, I think, reiterated the need to regain the universal moral condemnation and to shift public opinion. So Gerald, I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the most important steps to actually changing these sentiments, and how do you think we could best shift the dialogue away from the question of justifying torture or whether it's effective or not in the first place?
Well, I think first of all, I think also in the 9/11 context, what we had to learn was that how much public discourse matters in a negative sense, but also we had to learn after Obama came to power that the wheel did not turn around completely again, because public discourse and public perception had not been changed, if you take the US example. But it's also an example, I think, that shows that beyond the legal strategies that you use, it is about people speaking out against torture, take the example in the US of military lawyers, how powerful that was as a message in society. And I think that's what we need much more. We need prosecutors who speak out, not as human rights activists, but as a prosecutor who say it's a crime. If the state commits a crime, it's even more a crime for me as a prosecutor. I don't have to be a naive human rights defender to say it needs to be prosecuted. So we need more of these voices to get out from communities beyond the traditional human rights field. I think also religious communities, and there the US also is an example that that community was part also of reshifting a little bit the discussion. So I think that's my first point about how much public discourse matters, and that we have to focus much more broadening the constituency we bring into this discourse. In my work, I don't actually see, if you go to Europe, for example, such a strong assertion that torture is important and works. Maybe that is also particular to contexts. But what you see more is indifference. And that's what we have to fight. And for that, I think June 26 is important to give a face to the problem. I always see one example in the war on terror context, which might not be the best example here, but it just comes to my mind. In Germany, we knew about a lot of these things, but only when Murat Kurnas, a Turkish-German ex-Guantanamo detainee, his face was known, the Al-Masri case, people suddenly had a face, and suddenly you had a public opinion emerging. So I think this is where having faces that de-abstract in a way the issue of torture is fundamentally important. And then really to think also how damaging it is. If we have a very divisive world, if we want to convince people that human rights matter, how damaging double standards can be. And I think that's something we don't realize so much yet, but I work a lot in the former Soviet Union. I know that any double standard or perceived double standard in the West will be thrown back at the West immediately with rigor and viciously. And I think that's something in terms of how we want to win the moral ground back is by being faithful to our principles in our societies.
Thank you so much. Anybody else like to speak to that?
Let me interject. I completely agree with everything Gerard has said. I think the problem of gaining the moral high ground, even despite this poll by the Pew Charitable Trust, my sense is that we are regaining some of the lost ground. I think with all the examples that Gerard gave, but that we can also point out to reactions not only by former military, by some in the legal community, by the religious coalitions, etc. We are beginning to gain the moral condemnation again. The problem continues to be that the debate very quickly shifts to whether torture works, quote unquote, or not. And I've always thought that we needed to tackle that argument head on, because we do have the tools, we do have the information, we do have the statistics. We can show that the examples given for when torture works are false. They are completely taken out of context, and they don't even account for whether the same result or better results could have obtained without torture. So I think we do have arguments to make, but I am sometimes hesitant myself to engage in that, because it can be an endless discussion that more or less contributes to the relativization of the moral condemnation. I'm really of two minds about it, quite frankly, how much we get into that debate or not. And my final point on this is that it's not just that some states, propose torture or don't live up to their obligations under torture, as in the many examples that have been given. But I think the culture, the popular culture, induces us to tolerate, to accept culture. I think I suspect in that 35% worldwide that the Pew Charitable Trust mentions, there are a lot of people who abhor of torture, but who say it's inevitable, who think that it cannot be eradicated. Not so much that they are in favor of it, but that it's just there's nothing that can be done about it. And there, it's not only 0, dark 30 and 24, but even I would say some European police detective TV programs that tend also to condition us to believe that the torture victim is always the bad guy, and that the torture victim immediately produces the desired results as soon as he's even threatened with torture. And for those of us who work on this, we know that that's not the way torture works. But engaging the producers of popular culture in trying to get a more balanced assessment of these things, even while we appreciate that artistic license is sometimes necessary, is something that challenges us to confront these arguments with better arguments.
Yes, Carla, please.
Thank you. Just 2 quick points. One, a very practical one. It's not only that torture itself doesn't work. Torture will taint criminal evidence. And here it's another practical reason why the practice of torture and other cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment should be abolished, because it will impede the ability to investigate and prosecute crimes for which individuals have been accused. So that's one point. Another point with respect to popularizing this, there is a tendency to display stories of torture of individuals who are very far different or far removed from the average person in society. Yet, there are many examples of survivors of torture from all walks of life, and it's really quite important to show the wide diversity of survivors to dispel the myth that torture survivors are over there in some other country, very different from our experience, whichever country we're coming from. There are so many different kinds of survivors of torture, and it's important that we draw on that diversity in our respective campaigns.
Great. Yes, I see. Thank you so much. I see Laura would like to say something.
Just to add to that and build on it, I think to the question of whether or not torture works, I think in the faith community we would challenge that question and say in many ways we're asking the wrong question, and we have to pay attention to the questions that we pose impact where our gaze is focused, and we would say that in fact where torture is being perpetrated, we actually need to lift up a mirror on that and look at who we are as a people, what it means about who we are as a people, and the soul of our societies that would condone and allow these practices of torture to continue. So that looking at who it makes us to allow these forms of torture to continue is a critical question that we pose to ourselves and really challenge within our community.
Great. Thank you so much. We have just a few minutes left, so I think to conclude, if we could maybe go around and have everybody give a couple of last words, if you'd like maybe to speak to as a message to our listeners to how civil society and different organizations, including the United Nations and NGOs, how we can all work together better, how we can streamline and enhance our efforts to cooperate more effectively to create a torture-free world, or any last message that you would like to leave with us. So I think we can start with Annie, perhaps.
Sure. Just on the last sort of discussion point, just to, we speak a lot of, how torture it crushes a personality, it dehumanizes an individual, but also that even coming to the justification or the use of torture in and of itself, actually, there's already been dehumanizing of someone in order to get to that point. And so it's both a cause and an effect. And also just to point out that, that the effects of torture on individuals are long-term, and they impact communities, they impact families, and they, just this week we had, a man from a Southern African country who came and spoke at an event we put on here in Washington, D.C. He had been a businessman, had been active in pro-democracy politics. As a result of that, was threatened, was beaten, was left for dead. Ended up deciding to flee for his life and for the protection of his family. And and he spoke of how even as the wounds, the physical wounds on his body were healing, that his mind had been destroyed, and the assistance that he was able to receive from CDT, and there's many other great organizations around the world that are providing similar assistance to kind of help bring him back to who he was before, and help him remind himself of who he was before, and help him not be kind of debilitated by the sleep disorders, the anxiety, the depression that he was experiencing, was critical. But also, still, as a result of torture and the abuses he faced, he's still separated from his family. And there are many people who are in similar situations, whose families have been impacted, whose communities have been impacted, and who individually they continue to struggle. And I think it's just important to remember, I think in part, as Carla was pointing out earlier, that torture it's more than just the individual, even as the individual survivors are really at the center of what we're talking about today, but it's also the communities and the families and the greater, broader social impacts as well.
Thank you so much, Annie. If perhaps we could hear from Carla, your last words or anything you'd like to say before we conclude.
Thank you. I think there's a tendency for individuals around the world, some of the people who might be listening today, to think, wow, this job is so difficult. It's so complicated. Where do I begin? And I suppose my ending comment would be, don't let that deter you from doing something. There's always something that can be done, however small. This is a long-term project, unfortunately, but there are, from the tiniest things which seem inconsequential, recognizing that torture is taking place in one's community, giving a hand to a survivor of torture who feels completely alone, is a start of how we're going to address this horrible practice. So solidarity, and please take action.
Thank you so much. That's a very compelling message, so thank you. And if I could ask Gerald now, if you have any last words for us.
Well, it's like the last wish. No, maybe in following up to Carla, really, what I often feel is you don't have to be a human rights activist to be an anti-torture activist to some extent. And if you are in a professional capacity, as a police officer, as a prosecutor, you can play a role in fighting torture. If you're a member of the public being interested. So I think we should see that the fight against torture is not only about professionals who work on the issue of torture. But the second point, the final point, is for me, in a way, a positive one. I mean, if we look at how civil society is organized and works today, never in history it was as global. Never in history we had as many organizations across the world that work on torture. It's not like in the 70s or 60s where maybe you had an amnesty, etc. You have almost in all countries of the world activists who work against torture. So we have a potential there to use much more. And we just have to move a little bit out of our comfort zone and build broader constituency with all these actors around.
Great. Thank you very much. Laura?
Sure. I'll conclude by sharing a brief story, and that's from the state of California in 2011. As many of you know, thousands of incarcerated people throughout the state of California began participating in a statewide hunger strike to draw attention to the torture of long-term solitary confinement there, where on average individuals are held for 6.8 years in solitary confinement in that state. And they've since participated in 3 statewide hunger strikes, the largest of which was in 2013, where over 30,000 incarcerated persons took part in that hunger strike. What we learned and what we can learn from their brave witness is that something that many advocates have been talking about for a long time that was not gaining traction, the reality of the torture of isolation, was suddenly on the front page of the papers. Suddenly legislators were listening. Suddenly the media was listening. And so to us, this is a story of a reminder of how we must stand with those who have endured torture, stand with their loved ones, lift up their stories, and look at how we use and be accountable to our privilege and our spaces of power in ways that promote their stories being shared. Two tangible ways that we're doing that I would encourage you to take a look at and even take part in. NEARCAT has produced a new film about their witness called Breaking Down the Box. It features the UN Special Rapporteur on torture. You can see it live now visiting our website at nearcat.org/breaking down the box. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that to hear more of their stories. We also have a solitary cell replica that's touring the nation to make visible this form of torture. So would urge you, if it's visiting your city, to come and spend some time in the replica. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I think finally, if the Special Rapporteur would like to have a few concluding words.
Well, thank you very much. First, thanks all of you for participating in the audience, and my 4 fellow panelists and Andra. First, I'd like to say that if we want to prevent torture from happening, we need to concentrate on the unique obligation in the Convention Against Torture that each state has to investigate, prosecute, and punish every single act of torture. It's unique, now also unique to the disappearances, because it doesn't have to be a part of a pattern of widespread or systematic violations. The states still need not to let any instance of torture go unpunished. And unfortunately, this is an obligation that is observed in the breach almost throughout the world today. At most, we have some states that kind of stop torture from happening after it has happened, and even very powerful countries that have all the wherewithal, like the United States, to investigate, prosecute, and punish torture, decline to do so. But my final point that I'd like to say has to do with, also with a story, but picking up on something that Carla said earlier today about the many faces of torture and the many ways in which torture is practiced throughout the world. This week, because of the week in observance of the International Day of Victims of Torture, I had the privilege of hearing an Ethiopian woman who was the victim of political torture, but also earlier on of female genital mutilation, of forced marriage, and of domestic violence. And she was reminding everybody else, all the victims of political torture, that when we advocate for an end to torture, we don't forget that torture happens also in those realms of so-called private life in which pain and suffering is also inflicted, and where we owe it to all victims to incorporate their views into this campaign to obtain a torture-free world. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to all of the panelists for your wonderful contributions today. I will be wrapping up the webinar now. If any of our participants have any additional questions, please feel free to email me. My email is provided in the email that you received with your link to watch this webinar, or you can also email tortureFreeWorld@gmail.com. The video of this webinar will be available today or over the weekend at antitorture.org or at torturefreeworld.org. I'd like to thank Shireen from the WCL Media Control Center for her technical assistance today, and our Dean's Fellows Nikki Block, Thomas Marshall, and Charlotte Boylan for their valuable help. And finally, on behalf of the ATI Project and the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, once again, thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you at our next event.